Why, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on the organization of business. As we kind of get ourselves going, I just love to know, can you hear us? So let me know if you can hear us in the questions function. And then tell me where you guys are from. Are you postdocs, graduate students? Are you from NIH, outside the NIH? Give us a little information. Uh-oh, I don't have anybody putting anything in yet. Oh, there you are. Thanks, Melissa.
Okay, there's several. Put them in. Good.
Yeah, great. Great. So I think most everybody today will likely be from internal to NIH. Seems like, oh, but we have a postdoc from Syracuse. Well, I just lied. So NIAID, NIDDK, NCI, fantastic. Purdue, nice. Grad student outside of NIH, NHGRI, UNC Chapel Hill. Wow. NIEHS. Awesome. Well, we're going to get going so that we can be very prepared today. My name's Lori Conlon. I'm pleased today to have Brad Fackler with us today to talk about the organization of business. How are all these businesses organized? And I always love this one because I can figure out exactly what a matrix organization is. So Brad, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lori. And I want to start with the origin of this program. And I've worked with a number of PhD candidates and postdocs who are preparing to transition into industry positions. The vast majority have no experience in a business setting. And during the interviews, these people very comfortable talking about their scientific experience and skills relative to the position that they're seeking. But when the conversation shifted to things like how the lab contributed to the overall mission of the company, or how reporting relationships in the company were beyond just the lab, or the interviewers using particular business terminology to describe success criteria or other things that were relevant to the job, then these people got to be a little bit lost. So I put this presentation together to give you some background on how businesses are organized, and then some of the terminology that you will hear in organizations within the business beyond just the R&D. So let's start with something that if you have, now I can't advance the, oh, there we go. Okay, now I can advance the slide. If you had any experience in looking for an industry job, you have seen the job advertisement. And hopefully you have gone through this advertisement and you have highlighted the keywords in there, because you want to make sure your resume and what you talk about during the interview matches these keywords. But then you see things up here that are probably not necessarily familiar with. And that is that this position is the director of formulation development, and it reports to a senior vice president. And I've had people tell me that, hey, I am a little bit hesitant to send this in because this is a director position and it reports to a senior vice president. Well, I've highlighted these in green because these are things that you really don't pay any attention to. There's no really set scale, if you will, for how these positions are listed. And so while you may report to the senior vice president of regulatory and chief compliance, he may be one of only 5 people in the company. So you want to look at the keywords highlighted in yellow, but not necessarily here. So what we're going to talk about today is really, my goal here is to provide you with some basic understanding on company structures, position titles, and terminology to facilitate conversations with industry personnel prior to and during your industry interviews. So what we will cover is we'll cover the critical functions within all businesses. We will look at the ways then companies organize themselves to be able to perform those functions. We'll look at roles and job titles within R&D, and then we'll look at key tools and business terms that they use during their normal conversations. And since this is a business-related presentation, what I'm authorized to do is to award you an MBA at the end of this presentation. So let's start with the kind of very basics, and that is, in order for a company to succeed, it needs to be able to perform 4 functions. And this is not relative to industry, it goes across all industries. And this is from the lemonade stand that you may have set up when you were a kid, all the way to a General Motors or an Apple. They need to perform 4 functions. The one is they need to create their product or service. In essence, they need to think it up. They need to be able to make it. They need to be able to sell it, and they need to be able to account for the cash. So if you think about this in terms of your lemonade stand, you need to be able to you need to be able to think this up. Are you going to sell lemonade, or in your neighborhood, is iced tea a better option? So you have to think about that, and maybe you have to do some research. Then you need to be able to make it. You need to get up in your mom's cupboard. You need to get the sugar. You need to get the lemons. You need to be able to get the water and the ice and stir it all up. And then you need to be able to sell it. You need to take your little table out to the street corner, and you want to get a street corner where there's a lot of traffic, and you need to be able to sell it. And then you need to be able to account for the cash. This is your cigar box. So you have the cash coming in. And if you're a real good businessman, perhaps you've negotiated with your mother that she will supply that thing, so you get to keep all the cash. So as the companies grow, then they've put other names on these things. And so the creating it is the research and development. Making the product is manufacturing or operations. Selling the product is commercial, and accounting for the cash is the finance. So these 4 things, what every business has to do. And then in order to be able to do these 4 things, the company has to organize these functions in a logical way. And so first of all, we need to be able to expand on these a little bit. And that is that research and development takes into account research, which is the discovering of the products. It needs to be development, which is getting the product ready for the market. The regulatory function, which falls into there, which is in charge of product approval. The operations, they need to be able to manufacture it. They need to be able to then assure the quality and compliance with the standards. They need to be able to market it, which is create the product strategy, the product promotion, which is sales, and business development. And that is going out to maybe potentially other companies to get products, to either bring products in or products out. And finance and administration. This is accounting, which is the revenue and the money in, the money out, and finance, which is the fiscal planning and reporting. And then the administration functions usually fall into this area. So things like human resources, IT, and legal. So now that we have these functions, we have to be able to organize them so that each one of these can perform at the highest level. And companies will usually use a functional organization where there is a executive manager, that research and development reports into that, operations, commercial, and finance and administration all reporting to this executive function. And you can see that in here, this is what they do as they are performing the functions within their area. Now, there's different ways then that companies organize themselves around these functions. And the first is a flat organization. And there you see each of these business functions that report into the executive manager. And this is an organization that is more characteristic of a small company. And the reason that works is because they may not have people in all functions, or they may have people that actually do multiple functions. So for example, in an early stage biotech company, for example, they likely would not even have marketing and sales. As the organizations then grow, they organize into a hierarchical management or organizational structure. So you have the executive management, each of the functions report into that executive management. And so R&D, for example, has research reporting in, development, and regulatory. Operations has manufacturing and QA, and so on. Now, there are advantages of this hierarchical organization. And before I say that, I should actually say there is no perfect organizational structure that works all the time. There are advantages and disadvantages to each. So for example, in the hierarchical organization, that promotes functional effectiveness and efficiency. So within each of those individual functions, because of the management and the reporting structures, the functional effectiveness and efficiency is enhanced. And it encourages effective supervisor and subordinate relationships. However, sometimes it will inhibit cross-functional communication and collaboration. So if there is a need to coordinate between R&D and manufacturing, so to speak, that may be a problem in a hierarchical organization. And it can be, or that can result in functional power centers and fiefdoms in there, where certain organizations become inordinately strong because of that they are essentially separated from other parts of the organization. So if those problems persist, then the company may look at what's called a matrix organization. And so what I've tried to do is draw in that in this matrix organization, for example, regulatory and QA, which are important not only to the R&D, but also to the operations part, so they may be matrixed into both of those areas. So regulatory would report into both R&D and operations. Another common area here is in the area of business development. So business development is a function that may be active during the early stages of product discovery and development, and it also may be active as products are being commercialized. So oftentimes a business development function may report into both of these, so would be matrixed into both of these. Another way that you see this is there are times when the administrative functions such as HR, legal, and IT may be embedded into each one of these functions. So you may have a legal group that reports to commercial, a separate legal group that reports to operations, and so on. So you get what would be more like a business development kind of organization. Now, like the others, the hierarchical organization, the matrix organization has advantages. So this very much promotes the cross-functional communication and collaboration and supports effective project management initiatives. So one of the things that's going on right now is the companies that are very active in trying to discover a COVID-19 vaccine is likely in a matrix management organization, because not only do they have to discover it, but they have to figure out how they can manufacture it in enough quantity to actually be a viable product, and how to sell that, how to price it. So all of those things are probably being done in a very cross-functional way. So it has disadvantages as well. It can create functional inefficiencies, and that is if your organization needs to be very functionally oriented by having people that are reporting in from different areas or to different areas, that can make that inefficient. And it sometimes can result in problems in performance management. The saying is, if you have two bosses, you in effect have no bosses. So again, these are options that companies use, and depending on what the company is trying to do, they may actually go from one organization to another. Not particularly easy to do. A company that has performed in a hierarchical organization for a long time oftentimes has difficulty going to a matrix organization, and vice versa is true as well. So when we then organize these in either way, you see different job titles. So you will see these job titles, and you may see these on the job advertisements. So you may have in the executive suite, you may have a president or a chief executive officer. That one level down, you may have a chief scientific officer or a vice president of R&D. And again, I will point out there is no standard here. The terminology is really selected by each individual company. You'll have a vice president of operations. You may have a chief commercial officer or a vice president of marketing and sales. And you may have a chief financial officer or a vice president of finance. Now, the one thing that you see here is that you have chief officers named in 3 of the 4 functions, but not in operations. And the reason for that, and I should, before I get there, sorry, within each of these, you may have vice presidents of each of the areas, going down to directors in those various areas as well. And so what I was saying is that you don't have a chief operations officer here, because that term has taken on a little different meaning. In companies, you may have a chief operating officer that reports to the CEO, and that operating officer then has all of the functions that are needed to operate the business on a day-to-day basis reporting into he or she. And then you oftentimes would have the chief financial officer reporting into the CEO. This kind of organization is fairly common in companies that are relatively early stage and are trying to raise venture capital. So the CEO and oftentimes the CFO are out meeting with investors, doing road shows, trying to raise that money, while the chief operating officer is busy running the day-to-day operations of the company. So in the area of R&D, which is probably of most interest to this group, you will have this chief scientific officer or vice president of R&D or senior vice president of R&D, and into that person will report the vice president of research, the vice president of preclinical development, and the vice president of clinical development. So each, as the product or technology moves from phase to phase, it would go into a new area within the company. So what are the roles and responsibilities of this position? Of the area of research, which is conducting discovery research and participating in team participation and management. The career tracks are target identification, target validation, assay development, and new chemical entity development. So this is the group in charge of discovering the new technologies. And if you see those roles and responsibilities and those career tracks, you might note that those are not all that much different than what you may be doing in your lab today. Now, as we progress to the preclinical development, and remember, this would be the animal studies of a technology. It's drug characterization, evaluating and selecting the most promising, and conducting preclinical studies particularly in possibly other areas after the technology moves over into development. Again, you see metabolism, pharmacokinetics, tox, drug safety, pathology, pharmacology. Again, these are things you may be already doing in your lab today. And I bring that up because oftentimes the job ads will say, so many years of industry experience in this. And I think it's important to remember that you're doing these things, so you have that experience. If they're looking for 3 to 5 years in these areas, that's what you want to highlight on your resume. And then in the area of clinical development, you see the roles and responsibilities are a little bit different in that they are designing monitoring trials, trial oversight, and data verification. The career tracks, program management, clinical research associate. This is an area where today, even the large players, and I'm thinking here in the pharma industry, they outsource many of the trials to the CROs, clinical research organizations. And so the role within the company is really in the oversight role, management role. So design of the studies, they then give them over to the CRO, and they manage to make sure that the studies are run in the way that they're designed. So we'll look at some more department titles. And oops, sorry, I went too far. So in the area of research, in general, and this would be in a larger company, by the way, they will have below the vice president of research, they will have a director of several labs, and usually those labs are grouped within therapeutic areas. Each lab will have a lab manager, and then the positions that you might be interested in are called senior scientist, staff scientist, scientist 1, scientist 2, scientist 3, research associate, research fellow. Any of those you might see in the job ad. And to your director manager positions, those are positions in industry that are quasi equivalent to what a PI would be doing in the academic setting. In clinical and preclinical research, you have the same kind of setup. So you have directors that would have several labs reporting in, You would have managers in each individual lab or each individual technology that is being taken forward. And then the positions within the organization are very similar to what you would see in the research organization. Then a little bit differently in the clinical development. So the vice president and the director, they may be in charge of not only the people in the organization, but also in designing the trials, and then in the oversight. And the positions here you see are very different from what they are in the other two areas, because these are the people that are actually monitoring and running the clinical trials. Now, there's one other area within a company that I think it's at least important to mention, and that is the company's board of directors. The board of directors are made up of 3 to 15 business executives. If it's a small company, they may have 3, and there's no set number here. Many companies will have 6 to 8. 15 is the most I know of. That's General Motors, have 15. And they're made up of 2 types of directors. One are the independent or external directors. So these are people with long business experience, maybe not necessarily in the industry that they are in, but long-time business executives. And then there are the internal directors, and that is comprised of people within the organization who sit on the board of directors as well. Most often, it would be the CEO and or the CFO. And their role is oversight of proper financial reporting responsibilities. We'll talk a little bit later about the difference between a public company and a private company. The role the board of directors plays in a public company is much more than in a private company, because the reporting requirements in terms of the finances, there are so many more requirements for the public companies. So at this point, we're going to move away from organization, and we'll talk now about some key terms. And these are terms within each of these organizations. And these are common terms that business people talk about every day that you, in your experience, may not have been exposed to. And so my goal here is really just to not necessarily have you figure out or know what these are, but just so you have heard them before and you know the context that they might use. So we're going to start in the area of operations, and we'll start with some key terms that they use. Start with one that you're probably familiar with, the SOP, the standard operating procedures. These are the procedures that are written down and must be followed on a day-to-day basis. The next one is GLP, good laboratory practices, and that's a system of controls that ensures uniformity and consistency across labs. The organization that monitors this is an organization called CLIA, which is a part of the Health and Human Services part of the government. And CLIA stands for the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments that were done early this century. But they are the laboratory. These are the laboratory guidelines that must be followed as the technology proceeds from the preclinical stage to the clinical stage. The next are GMP, or good manufacturing processes, and you may have heard of these. These, like the laboratory practices, are the SOPs, if you will, for manufacturing that ensures that the product or technology is compliant with the manufacturing standards set out by the government for the trials. The organization that monitors this is the FDA. The other one is the SKU. This is, and you'll notice these are not, these initials or acronyms are not particularly heady, but this is a stock keeping unit, which is a unique identifier for every product sold. This is across all industry, across everywhere. These are the barcodes, if you will, that you see on the products when you go to the grocery store or any store. This is how the company keeps track of the products within their inventory. And the final one in operations is a pilot plant. And this is similar to the manufacturing, the normal manufacturing of the company, but it simply manufactures in smaller quantities for the purpose of the clinical trial usage. So, and now we move to the finance and the board of directors. And before we get into the terms, I want to talk a little bit about some key reports that companies use from a financial perspective. And then we'll talk about some of the terms that the board of directors and the finance people would talk about. The first is the balance sheet. This is kind of the granddaddy, if you will, of all the financial reports. And this is what a company shows at the end of each fiscal period. Most companies will show these on a quarterly and then on an annual basis. And this tells people how the company is performing. It's made up of three parts. There are the assets. Those are the positive attributes, what the company owns. These are the liabilities, and that is the negative aspects, what the company owes. And then there is the shareholder equity, or what is called the book value. And you will look at the formula here that assets equals liabilities plus shareholder equity. So in essence, and this is particularly in small companies, you will look at the difference between the assets and the liabilities, and any positive would be the shareholder equity. So that is the part that the shareholders own. If the shareholder is just an individual, it is the owner's equity, but that is then the value of the company. If you can see in the example here, the total assets are 2.16 million. The liabilities are 1. Trying to look here. So equity, okay. So the liabilities are 460,000, and the difference between the 2.16 and the 1. And the 460 would be 1.7. So the owner's value of the company is 1.7 million in this example. Next is the income statement. This one is often called the P&L statement, and this shows how the profits and the expenditures change over a given period of time. So it looks at, excuse me, it looks at revenues from primary activities, revenues from other activities, and then gains from non-business activities. I wouldn't know what those are, and then it looks at the expenses and the losses. So the costs that you have from your primary, secondary activity, and losses from long-term assets. So that might be investments or things like that. And so you look at how does your income, how does it change? Either it grows or it is less over the period of time. So you will look at, you will hear sometimes in the news where a large company, Ford Motor Company, operates at a loss of X hundred millions of dollars for a particular period of time. Well, what that's telling you is that the expenses and the losses were greater than the revenues for that period of time. Then you have the cash flow statement, and that looks at just how cash changes during that same period. This is very similar to the previous statement. That looks at all income and all losses. This looks at just the cash that comes in from operating activities, investing activities, and financial activities. And finally, then you have the shareholder equity, the statement of shareholder equity. And as I said, that equity is the difference between the assets and the liabilities. If it's positive, the owner equity is the owners have equity in the company. If it is negative, which is not necessarily uncommon, particularly in early stage companies, then companies need to start on strategies that can make that that can make that equity that can make it worthwhile. And so I want to just take a minute here after we've looked at those and just kind of give you an idea of how these all fit together and how companies would use them. Excuse me. So for time period one, we will say that is, we'll say Q1 of the year, you have a beginning balance sheet. So you have cash, other assets, you have total assets, you have a total of liabilities. The difference is the shareholder equity, and then the total of shareholder equity and liabilities, which would match the total assets. Then over the period of the next quarter, you have things that change. So you have the statement of cash flow. How does cash change during the period of the quarter? So is your cash going up or is your cash going down from the various sources of that cash? So you'll see a net change. You hope it's positive. It could be positive. It could be negative. I'm going to go to the bottom, which is the income statement. This looks at all income, so your revenue minus your expenses, which would be net income. This is the one where you see the companies who are the companies that will say, oh, I've lost X million dollars. That's because the expenses are greater than the revenues. And then you have this figure that goes into what is called retained earnings, and that would be the earnings of that period, and that will give you the figures into how the owner's equity has changed. And then these two statements go back into the balance sheet for the next quarter. So cash is either higher or lower. Other assets are either higher or lower. Your owner's equity is either higher or lower based on the performance. And so you start the process all over again. So we'll take a look at some terminology here. And the first is gross income, and that's the total revenue that you receive before you subtract anything out. So before any of the costs are taken out. So the gross profit then is the gross revenue minus the production costs. So it's just the revenues minus production. It doesn't take into account any of the other costs here which would be like rent or salaries or anything like that. The net profit then is the return made on your revenues minus all of the costs from the gross receipt. And this would be, you're hoping that you're not spending too much to make your revenues, so that is a positive number. Revenues is just the amount that is realized from the sale of company goods. And the other one is EBIT, which is called, and that stands for earnings before interest and taxes. And what that's based on is that companies in different areas and companies that are of different sizes and with different structures sometimes have different tax liabilities or interest liabilities. So it's factoring those out and gives the analyst way to compare company performance across a number of different industries and situations. Next, we have COGS. That's the cost of goods sold. So as you're looking at your gross profit, et cetera, this would be the costs that you would put in. How much does it cost to manufacture the products that you're selling? GAAP, this is the standard reporting principles. This is a very US number. This is for US companies. So that the GAAP is generally accepted accounting principles, and that is just a way to make sure that the reporting is done on a fair and balanced way, and it's done across all companies. Then we talked a little bit about the difference between a public company and a private. A public company is a company whose stock is traded on one of the international exchanges, and a private company who has a sole ownership or a group ownership, but its stock is not traded. And as I said previously, there are a lot more Securities Exchange Commission reporting requirements for public companies than there are for private companies. And so finally, we get into commercial. We'll talk a little bit now about the commercial terms, so that if they use those terms, you will be able to know at least what they're talking about. The brand identity is the outward expression of the product, which is including the communication style, the logo, other visible elements. So what does the product look like? In today's environment, cars look pretty much the same across a whole lot of manufacturers. So the brand identity is really oftentimes around the logo of the car. The brand image is the impression of the product held by the consumers. The best example of that I can say is that a brand image of Volvo, for example, is safety. So when you say safety, almost everybody thinks of Volvo. Market share is the portion of the market that is controlled by an individual product or a company. So you would look at, and you would look at, for example, in a market where multiple products exist, you would look at the change of market share of your product versus the other products. So if you're growing faster than the other products, then you're growing market share. You're doing better. And even if the market may be declining, if you're doing better than the other competitors in the marketplace, you may be able to sustain your business. The share of voice is an advertising measure. How does your advertising compare to the other advertisers in the marketplace? Share of voice is a really big issue in the area of consumer products. So if you're watching a sporting event, which we can't do anymore, but we will be able to, beer commercials are a very good example. So oftentimes you will see Budweiser, you will see Anheuser-Busch, you will see Miller Coors. So you will see those, and they have to advertise so much to keep their market share. And in fact, in the consumer goods industries, oftentimes the market share is directly corresponds to the share of advertising voice. So 3 really key terms in the area of commercial is segmentation, targeting, and positioning. And the segmentation is, how does a company divide the market up into viable segments? So there are viable segments. Those segments are driven by customer action, customer views, age, a lot of different things. So companies divide those segments up. And then depending on what the product is, they will target certain of those customers, because the target segments are the ones that have the highest potential for purchasing their product. And then positioning is a strategy where the brand tries to establish a distinct position. What is it that you want that target group of customers to know about your product versus the competitive brands? So they start with segmentation of all people, they pick their targets, and then they position their product within those target segments. So with that, we come to the end of this. There are a number of resources that are available for those of you who are NIHers. There are a number of books. The Career Opportunities in Biotech and Drug Development is a very good overview of all the positions that are out there. We do a number of similar kinds of seminars for those of you that are considering an industry position or in the process of an industry or in the process of interviewing for industry processes. The OIT Careers blog, which is very good, a number of targets and a vast number of articles, some of which are focused on in industry positions. And for those of you that are in NIH and are looking to do that, or maybe just beginning to consider that, you can make a Zoom appointment through the OITE Careers website. And so as I said before, after you sit through this and now you know all these terms and you know how companies are organized, I am able to give you an MBA. And so you all now have the mastery of Brad's answers. So with that, I will take some questions.
So Brad, one of the
Yes.
questions that I think is really a really interesting question is, how can biotechs or startups maintain their finances when they're not even selling any products at the beginning?
Yeah, there's a whole lot into that question. As a biotech starts out, they go through a progression of funding sources. And so as they are developing their product, oftentimes they will start with grant funding. And then from there, they will progress into venture capital funding. So they will get venture funding that will last them for so long until they get to the point of where the product is on the market and revenues. And you're absolutely correct, particularly in the area of biotech, of pharmaceuticals, and even to a point, medical devices. That time frame is a long time. So there are specific investors that will invest in biotech knowing that they're not going to get a return on that investment within about 18 months.
Yeah. We're waiting to see if anything else kind of comes in here through the question function.
Okay.
It's always hard because we don't know if people are typing or if they're not paying attention.
Yeah, if they went to sleep.
Yeah, right? So we do want to make sure that all of you who are NIH intramural trainees know that you can make an appointment with Brad off the OITE webpage through the Career Services button. And we'd really love for you guys to have those one-on-one time with Brad to talk about your careers in industry. All right, Brad, well, nothing else has come in. So I think we are finished for today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I know this one is a little bit outside of what people are usually experiencing, but it's designed that way. It's designed to give you information on industries and terminologies that you likely won't hear until you start your interview process.
Great, great. Okay, so someone's asked about academic creating a resume. We'll do there's a lot of resources on our OITE YouTube page on how to make a resume from your CV. So I'll go there. And Dong, I see your question and I'll answer it offline. So thank you everybody for coming, and we will see you next time at an OITE event. Bye everybody.
Goodbye.